Identity is infrastructure. There is a phrase I want us to think about today. Identity is infrastructure. When we hear the word infrastructure, we normally think about roads, bridges, electricity, water, hospitals, schools, and communication networks. And rightly so, a country cannot develop without functioning infrastructure. But there is another form of infrastructure that receives far less attention. You cannot photograph it from the air, you cannot drive on it, you cannot measure it in kilometers, yet it influences almost everything a society eventually builds. That infrastructure is identity. Before people build institutions, universities, businesses, or governments, they carry an idea of who they are. They carry assumptions about what they are capable of, memories about where they came from, and beliefs about whose knowledge they should trust. So when I say identity is infrastructure, I mean something simple. The story a people believe about themselves influences the society they create. And for Africa, this question deserves serious attention. What happens when identity is disrupted? Think about the African child growing up today. Ask that child about ancient Rome, the British Empire, Christianity, European history, or American history, and there is a good chance they have encountered those subjects. Now ask, who were your ancestors? What political systems existed where your family came from? How did they educate children, understand justice, or resolve disputes? What did they know about agriculture, medicine, or the environment? What languages did your grandparents speak? Sometimes there is silence. A person can know more about another civilization than they know about the people from whom they descended. That is not merely a gap in historical knowledge. It can become a gap in identity. When history becomes psychology, history does something psychologically powerful. It tells you where you belong in the human story. Imagine two children. One grows up knowing that their ancestors created societies, traded across regions, produced knowledge, governed communities, developed spiritual traditions, and solved problems. The other encounters their ancestors mainly as slaves, colonial subjects, or recipients of somebody else's civilization. What psychological difference might that create? The first child understands that their ancestors had agency. The second may unconsciously begin to associate agency with somebody else. This does not mean manufacturing glorious stories simply to make African children feel good. Pre-colonial Africa was not paradise. There were wars, inequalities, political struggles, and practices that deserve criticism. Our ancestors were human beings, but that is precisely the point. They were human beings participating in history. They were not empty vessels waiting for history to begin when Europeans arrived. Recovering identity does not require us to romanticize our ancestors. It requires us to know them. Colonialism was not only about territory. Colonialism involved land, resources, borders, and political control. But it also affected how colonized people understood themselves. If people eventually believe that somebody else's language is inherently more intelligent, their religion more civilized, their institutions more sophisticated, and their culture more advanced, something profound has happened. You no longer need to constantly tell people that you are superior. They may begin repeating the message themselves. Eventually, they may teach it to their children. That is why independence cannot simply mean changing the flag. A country can achieve political independence while parts of its imagination remain dependent. If the foundation remains damaged, new institutions can still be built on old assumptions. Look at language. Consider language. Across Africa, many educated people speak European languages extremely well, but struggle to have sophisticated conversations in the languages of their grandparents. Learning English, French, Portuguese, or another international language is not the problem. Languages are tools. The problem begins when gaining one language requires becoming ashamed of another. When an African language becomes associated with backwardness, while a European language becomes associated with intelligence, that is no longer simply communication. That is hierarchy. Children notice which language is used in school, which appears in important documents, and which is associated with professional success. Eventually, those cultural messages become psychological infrastructure. Identity has economic consequences. Can identity influence economics? I believe it can. Imagine a society where imported products automatically carry greater prestige than locally produced products. Consumer behavior follows perception. Or imagine a society that exports raw materials but doubts its ability to transform those materials into sophisticated finished products. Of course, economics is far more complicated than psychology. Capital, technology, energy, trade, infrastructure, governance, institutions, and global economic structures all matter. Changing how Africans think about themselves will not magically solve these problems. But neither should we pretend psychology has no economic consequences. Economies are human systems. Human beings decide what to invest in, what to purchase, what to manufacture, and what they believe is possible. Confidence without competence achieves very little. But competence without confidence may never be deployed. We need both. This is not about rejecting everything foreign. Recovering African identity does not mean rejecting everything European or pretending foreign ideas have no value. It certainly does not mean isolating Africa from the world. Human civilization has always developed through exchange. People borrow technologies, words, and ideas. They trade, migrate, and learn. The problem is not exchange. The problem is exchange without a secure foundation. If I know who I am, I can encounter another culture, learn from it, and incorporate useful ideas without believing I must become somebody else. But if I have been taught that almost everything meaningful comes from elsewhere, learning can gradually become imitation. And imitation can eventually become erasure. So how do we rebuild? Reconstruction begins with something surprisingly simple. Questions. Ask your parents where your family came from. Ask your grandparents while they are still alive. Record their stories. Learn the meaning of your family name. Understand your language. Investigate your community's history. Read African history beyond slavery and colonialism. Study African civilizations critically. Investigate indigenous knowledge and spiritual systems rather than accepting romantic or hostile descriptions without examination. And teach children that African history did not begin with European contact. But we must go further than knowledge. Identity must become productive. What are we building? What institutions are we creating? What knowledge are we producing? What are we leaving behind? There is little value in spending our lives talking about the greatness of our ancestors while creating nothing for our descendants. Our ancestors had their time. This is ours. The objective is not to return to an imagined perfect African past. We cannot go backwards, and we should not want to. The objective is to recover enough historical memory that we can move forward without being strangers to ourselves. That is one of the central ideas behind broken ancestry. Perhaps some of the problems we see on the surface are connected to foundations we rarely examine. Roads are infrastructure. Schools are infrastructure. Energy systems are infrastructure. Institutions are infrastructure. But underneath all of them are human beings. And human beings carry identities, stories, memories, and beliefs about what they are capable of becoming. So perhaps African reconstruction begins not only with what we build around ourselves. Perhaps it also requires examining what has been built inside us. Identity is infrastructure. And damaged infrastructure can be rebuilt. If this conversation made you think, share this video with somebody who might see the question differently. And tell me in the comments, if identity is infrastructure, what part of African identity do you believe we need to rebuild first? If you would like to explore these ideas more deeply, you can listen to the Broken Ancestry audiobook on PayHip or find the ebook and textbook edition on Amazon UK. Share the conversation, leave a comment, and let us keep asking the questions that perhaps we should have been asking a long time ago.